Hello, Dilar, do you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hello,
How are you?
How are you? Were you able to listen a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, cool, good. So, our second speaker today is Dilar Dirik. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge, and she's currently a postdoctoral researcher and course convener at the University of Oxford. Congratulations. And author of the forthcoming book that we are all excited to read, The Kurdish Women's Movement, History, Theory, Practice. She will hold a lecture with the title, Morbid Meaning Making, Martyrs as Anticolonial Archives. So, to all further ado, I will just give the word to you, and thanks for being with us, Dilar.
Thank you so much, Gal. It's really a pleasure to be participating in this event. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, so many thanks to you, to Aziza, to Paula, and everybody that made this event possible. And hello to all the participants whom I cannot see right now, but I look forward to your interaction. I would like to start with a video. I had sent it to the team beforehand. If you can just please show the video clip number 1 before I begin. Yeah. So what you have just watched is a video from a couple of years ago. It's a Newroz celebration, which is the New Year celebrated as marked by people in different communities in Western Asia and Central Asia, and which has a particularly political meaning for the Kurdish community as a day of uprising, of rebellion, revolution, and resistance. And this was in the city of Ahmet, which is Diyarbakir in Turkish. This is the largest Kurdish city inside Turkey or northern Kurdistan. And you can see banners and flags of the legal political party, the HDP, the People's Democratic Party. You see banned flags of the Kurdistan Workers' Party and other symbols that are usually not allowed inside Turkey, and for which many people are, of course, in prison, because these are symbols associated with the biggest enemy of the Turkish state, namely the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which has been waging a war against the Turkish state since the 1980s, but which was formed in 1978, originally as a Marxist-Leninist socialist party to seek an independent Kurdish state. So there are many things that can be unpacked when it comes to the partisan nature of the Kurdish political movement that has evolved around the ideology and practices of this guerrilla movement called Kurdistan Workers' Party and its expressions today. But I will focus on one thing today, which is basically the importance of the martyrs in the struggle. And of course, I want to start out by acknowledging that talking about martyrs, talking about dead people is very macabre and grim in many ways. But I would argue that in the context of anti-colonial struggle, martyr remembrance also represents an alternative history to the dominant history of the oppressor, and in this case, also the nation-statist system. And in the context of the Kurdish freedom movement, martyrs also signify a spiritual rejection of meaninglessness of life under capitalist modernity, and also archiving the martyrs and their stories and their life trajectories as revolutionaries who fight against different systems such as patriarchy, capitalism, the nation state, also is like inverting the colors of a photograph in order to create a negative, if you will. I'll elaborate on this later on, but I want to say that by animating the dead, the movement also brings into being the unwritten and erased history of a people whose existence and history has been denied by the state system, and also statist civilization more broadly. This is a term used by the movement, which I will explain later on. And the remembrance of the martyrs, or rather understanding the role of the martyrs, also allows for a more social history understanding of this political movement, because the different martyrs of the struggle also embody different identities, whether as women, as people from the working class, people from privileged classes, non-Kurdish individuals, and so on. And basically what I want to do in this presentation is to look at three different things in relation to this. I'll begin by mapping a little bit of context on the role of the martyrs and how they have historically not only been individuals who have dedicated their lives and who have lost their lives in the course of their participation in political struggle, but also they have become occasions to theorize what revolution means. And over time, this has evolved into a more social, political, moral culture, because the martyr also represents a form of sacrifice. The martyr represents a devotion to life outside of the dominant system, and because it's also associated with guerrilla life, which takes place outside of the capitalist economy and its ideology. So I will map a little bit how the martyr is also kind of celebrated in Kurdish communities, also in the diaspora. And lastly, I will focus especially on the role of women martyrs and how the death of women has also in the last 30, 40 years played a big role in the legitimization of women's autonomy in the struggle. And specifically, I will not focus so much on Kurdish women martyrs in the Kurdish struggle, but I will look at internationalist women who have joined the Kurdish struggle, and how in recent years, especially in light of the developments inside Rojava in northern Syria, the martyrdoms of individual internationalist women such as Anna Campbell, Ivana Hofmann, and Alina Sanchez have also enriched the political vocabulary of the movement and its projects towards women's internationalism and new forms of anti-fascism and anti-colonialism that are not statist in nature. So I will just share my screen with you. Bear with me 1 second. So you should be able to see my screen right now. This is a photo that I took in 2015 in Mahmoud refugee camp. This is a refugee camp in Iraqi Kurdistan. And I just wanted to start with this slide just so you can see that this is a scene that, I mean, this is a hall in the refugee camp that is dedicated to the martyrs of the struggle. And because this is a very politicized camp that has been historically supportive of the guerrillas. And in fact, this is a community of people that were displaced from their villages inside Turkey and had to cross over into Iraq, that refused to collaborate with the state. And because many of the guerrillas were actually coming from these villages. And so the states ended up collectively punishing these people and destroying up to 5,000 villages in the 1990s. So this is a very politicized refugee community, and there is this martyr remembrance hall in
in this refugee camp in Iraq. But this is a scene that you can see, maybe not this many photos, but whenever you go to a Kurdish community center anywhere in Europe also, you will see that the photos of martyrs are almost omnipresent. And what I want to do today also is to speak a bit about martyrs and the extreme forms of sacrifice that exist in the Kurdish movement as well, what some people would call extreme. And because I think that in recent years, especially with the fight against the so-called Islamic State, there has been a very myopic understanding of what the Kurdish struggle is. And there's this concerted effort to kind of dislocate it from its ideological socialist roots. Specifically, we see this with the glorification of the Kurdish women fighter, which now is kind of described in highly liberal, marketized ways, but actually these women fighters who have been fighting against the state have also historically fought against the second largest NATO army, the Turkish state, and they have also been, of course, terror labeled in Europe, including in Austria. So the history of martyrs is very significant when we look at the prison resistance that took place in the early 1980s in Turkey. This was in the immediate aftermath of the Turkish military coup that happened in that time, and which was a huge crackdown against the left at the time inside Turkey. And tens of thousands of people were imprisoned, people were tortured, people disappeared. It was a very dark and grim time. And as I mentioned, Turkey is a NATO member, and that means that anti-communism was a very strong factor in that time. So the left in Turkey was really decimated in this period. But it was also the same time when the Kurdish national movement, which was a socialist movement, the movement around the Kurdistan Workers' Party was not a nationalist Kurdish movement, it was a socialist movement that wanted to unite with the proletariat in the country and fight against colonialism and imperialism on a global scale, but which recognized that the Kurdish people also needed there. And so it was very much in the same kind of context as many other Marxist-Leninist movements at the time. But there is the person in the middle here, Mazlum Doğan. He was one of the leading party members in prison at the time in 1982. So on Newroz Day, as I mentioned earlier, Newroz is the 21st of March, which is the new year for different communities in West Asia and in Central Asia. He was among the people who were systematically tortured. And I don't want to really get into the details of the torture, but it was really extreme. People had to eat their own shit, basically, or that of animals. They were tortured, they were raped. It was really dehumanizing and degrading, and many people actually turned into agents at the time, or gave up the struggle, and it was a very, very bad and dark time. So in that context, Mazlum Doğan, whilst resisting together with the other political prisoners, he lit his cell on fire. And it is said he did that with 3 matches, so that became a symbol of that as well. And he lit himself on fire in his prison cell, and he left a letter behind him, and that was picked up by the other prisoners. And here I just want to quote quickly from Sakine Cansız, who's one of the most known women martyrs of the Kurdistan Workers' Party. She was killed in Paris in 2013, along with 2 other Kurdish women revolutionaries by the Turkish intelligence. And she was part of the prison resistance and also quite symbolic. She said earlier he had written, Mazlum Doğan, "Surrender leads to betrayal, resistance to victory. Slowly we realized that he had intended to send us a Newroz message. Resistance is life." Mazlum's action became a milestone event for PKK resistance. From now on, we would all measure ourselves against his commitment. On one side was the infamy of betrayal in a situation of terror. On the other side was the greatness of Mazlum's heroic act. So soon after, there was the action of the 4, just less than 2 months after. So Mazlum Doğan's action first sparked this huge resistance, and including self-defense, including attacks on the prison guards. And there was also a lot of politicization and protests outside of the prison. But around the same time, just a few weeks after that, these 4 people, who were also PKK leading members, left a letter behind, and then they burned themselves alive as well. because people were dying in the prison anyway, and the logic of these people was to die at least on a self-determined, in a self-determined fashion, rather than to be humiliated to death by the state. And they wrote, all over the world, the struggles of anti-imperialists, anti-fascists, and anti-colonialists are progressing with pain, effort, life, blood, and suffering. If the wheel of history continues to turn today, we owe it to the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Cubans, Palestinians, the Kurdish people, the Russian, German, and Bulgarian proletariat, who paid for it with their blood and their lives. So you can see there's this emphasis on internationalism as well. And all of these individuals, they killed themselves in order to mobilize and actually escalate other people's actions. So they knew, or they counted on their deaths being picked up by their comrades in order to continue and in fact radicalize the struggle. Now I want to come to the person who is considered to be the first Kurdish woman to have committed an act of what's often is called a suicide action. This is Zeynep Kınaçı, or Zilan, her code name. She, in 1996, at a time of extreme violence between the Kurdistan Workers' Party and the Turkish state, she exploded herself. She put bombs on her body, and she pretended to be pregnant, and she attacked an army point in Dersim. And she left a letter behind, and it seemed that she planned this action by herself. She didn't tell anyone beforehand, and this was not a practice that was done in the movement at the time, suicide actions. She wrote a very long letter in which she explained that socialism was not doing enough, socialist theory was not enough in its understanding of women's liberation, that socialist theory was suffering from an absence of analysis of the very deep ways in which patriarchy is actually part of class oppression. So she gave a criticism of socialist theory because of its lack of understanding of patriarchy also as a form of subjugation and domination. And she called on the Kurdish women to organize themselves autonomously and to not just become attachments to the national struggle, but to really become their own struggle dynamic. And she wrote, by exploding a bomb against my body, I want to protest against the policies of imperialism, which enslave women and express the greatness of my rage and wrath and become a symbol of the resurrection of Kurdish women. So, of course, this is a very, very scary thing to think about, that somebody would put bombs on their body, and I mean, this is universally condemned all over the world, and it is one of the reasons why this movement is considered to be a terrorist organization by Turkey and others. But what I want to point out here is that at this time, this actually had a hugely, it was interpreted as a turning point. And in fact, Öcalan, the leader of the movement, and the women in the party at the time really saw this as an occasion to stop and focus on deepening their understanding of women's liberation and why it cannot be a secondary principle after national liberation and other things. So already in the 1990s, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there had been attempts inside the movement to dissociate socialism from the state, and also to focus more on the role of women. So women had been part of the guerrilla, and they were part of party formation from the beginning. So women were always there, but they were quite a small minority. And in the 1990s, when the village destruction started, many women from the rural villages started to join. So the early women, and also generally the early makeup, socioeconomic makeup of the party was working class university students. But in the 1990s, when the villages were destroyed, many people from very conservative sections of society joined. They were from tribes, they were quite religious, very conservative, and often less educated. So there was a class conflict that happened in the 90s in this movement as well. So Zilan's intervention at this time came when the movement had already taken steps just a few years before that towards self-organized and autonomous women's units, and the beginning of a theorization of patriarchy as being connected to the state and capitalism. But her letter, which is a very long letter, and unfortunately, oftentimes people just kind of cite Zilan's suicide action and say this was after which women felt pressured to perform very radical and extreme actions. But actually, if you go and read the letter itself, you see that there is a very theoretical component to it as well. And so this marked a shift at the time. And what I want to emphasize here is that martyrs like Mazlum Doğan and Zilan, they are often they have often been turned into occasions in the movement to rethink ideology and to rethink theory and practice. For example, there are other people that I cannot get into them in detail, but they often were seen as representing something. So Mazlum Doğan was representing the importance of resistance against all odds in prison. Zilan was representing the will of the women's movement to continue and also resist against male domination inside the party itself. And this is just a photo I took in Rojava in a women's academy in northern Syria. And you can see on the above banner, it says symbols of revolutionary women's symbols. You see Sakine Cansız, Fidan Doğan, and Leyla Şailemez, who were killed in Paris in 2013. Along them are Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg. And at the bottom, you see other martyrs as well, and a figure of Mother Mary. This is a women's academy. And I will get a little bit into this long-term conceptualization of martyrdom also in the movement. But I want to say that martyrs are omnipresent in so many different spheres of the. This is a photo from the internet. I didn't take this myself. This is an assembly of the Kongresar, which is the women's movement in Rojava. And in the back, you again see photos of martyrs from different places. So we can say that martyrs also, in a way, they connect different sides of the struggle. They connect the guerrilla to the politicians, to the families, and they also stand in a way for insistence on a different life outside of capitalist relations, but they also represent an insistence on Kurdish existence, on women's existence, and so on. And I want to just give a few examples also, because I know I'm conscious of time. But I want to say before I get to the next section, maybe that it's very important to keep in mind that the martyr remembrance is a very important aspect of the moral and political culture of the movement. So in places where the movement is organized, whenever somebody dies, I mean, there are many people from Europe who join the struggle and go to the guerrilla. Oftentimes, the assemblies meet up and take care of the family's needs. Martyrs are regularly commemorated. There are assemblies named after them, academies named after them, refugee camps named after them, songs dedicated to them. So there's a whole culture around martyrdom. And increasingly, as I mentioned in the recent years, more and more non-Kurdish people who have also joined the realm of the martyrs. And I wanted to show a video from the Zilan festival that takes place every year in Germany, but I don't think we have enough time. Maybe if we do, we can do that later. But it's not really that dark if you think about it. The individual martyrs are also seen as in very joyful terms because not only do they bring people together, as in people have emotional attachments to them, and people form friendships because they have known a martyr, both people, or they're also kind of, it's hard to articulate these things if you don't really know the environment in which this is taking place. That's why I wanted to show the video. But I will try to keep the rest of the presentation relatively brief so we can maybe clarify certain questions in the presentation, in the Q&A. One thing to stress is that oftentimes the background of the martyr is very important. So many of them come from the poor working classes, many of them are peasants, some people come from Europe, and some people are university degree holders. So in that sense, it's also a form of dismantling class as well in the movement, which there's a lot of discourse around class anyway. But like I said, there's a whole culture around this, sorry. One very important thing to say is that the Turkish state is also routinely attacking cemeteries of the martyrs, because it is very much aware that that the martyrs, the guerrilla dead bodies, play a very important role. So there's often this vandalization of cemeteries, and it shows that the state also recognizes how emotionally attached people are to the martyrs. But I want to now come to my final part of the presentation and just talk a little bit about what happened in recent years in light of the Rojava revolution. So this is Ayşe Deniz Karacagil. She's a Turkish woman, a young Turkish woman who died in Rojava in the last couple of years. She first became known inside Turkey during the Gezi Park protests in 2013. She was interviewed by CNN Turkish and many other mainstream outlets in Turkey at the time about Gezi Park and what it meant. And over time, one day she joined the Kurdish guerrillas, and then she died defending Rojava against ISIS. So she became a very important figure for a renewing of the relationship between the Turkish left and the Kurdish movement. This is a bond that had been broken in the early 90s already, but it's quite a fragile bond. But many Turkish internationalists have recently lost their lives, including young women such as her. She's not the only one, but she was one of the most well-known because of her prominence during the Gezi Park uprisings. This is Alina Sanchez. She's a woman from Argentina who was trained as a medical doctor in Cuba. So many people have often compared her trajectory to that of Che Guevara. She's basically, she spent time in the guerrilla, in the Kurdish guerrilla, and then she lost her life actually in a car accident in Rojava after helping to set up the healthcare system there. You can see in the photo on the right, this is the commemoration, I think it was in Buenos Aires. And previously, Legerin, that's her code name, or Alina Sanchez, had traveled on behalf of the Kurdish women's movement to Latin America and actually helped create some of the first relationships between the Kurdish women's movement and Latin American feminist movements. So she was then, she's now symbolizing basically what the movement calls the bridge between Kurdistan and Latin America. And many other internationalists, many other Latin American women, encouraged by her, started to get in touch or even join the Kurdish movement, not just the guerrilla, but also other civilian spheres. This is a photo of Ivana Hofmann, who was a Black German communist, very young as well. She died in Rojava whilst fighting against ISIS already in 2014 or 15. And she was also queer. She's a lesbian young woman, and she was a communist involved in different internationalist works who knew the movement from Germany. And she was the first internationalist actually to lose her life in Rojava. And this is a photo that I took there. It's one of the squares in Kamishlo, which is a city in northern Syria. And ever since, there has been an annual Ivana Hofmann festival against fascism and for internationalism that is in Duisburg, around where she grew up. And finally, this is Anna Campbell, or codename Helen Karacho, who was also queer. She was an anti-fascist based from the UK. She was known as a Hunt saboteur, an anti-fascist, an anarchist. She was well known in anarchist radical left circles in the UK. She lost her life during the Turkish invasion of Afrin in 2018. And in the aftermath of her death, the radical left in the UK also connected much more with the Kurdish movement in the UK and elsewhere. And her comrades have been at the forefront of campaigns such as Women Defend Rojava in the aftermath of Turkish invasions. There's a lot of work being done around against the arms trade, for example, and many others. So what I'm trying to explain here is that the death of these individual women, martyrs who have lost their lives in Kurdistan, has become an occasion for different struggles that these people were involved in to connect with the movement. This is also there's in the UK a Zilan festival as well, but in recent years it has been renamed and it's now the Zilan and Ana festival. I know I'm running out of time entirely, so I will just give my concluding remarks.
Okay.
I think
it's good to wrap up, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Sure.
I can also just stop here and maybe we can go into the questions. I'm happy to do that as well. I just had some concluding remarks, but I'm sure I can mention those also in the Q&A.
Yeah, no, you can conclude. Feel free to have a remark.
I think one just very important thing that I want to say is that in the movement's ideology and in its language, anti-colonialism is not just confined to the struggle against a colonizer, for example, the Turkish state or European colonialism, but also it is the state that is the colonizer itself. So I haven't talked about the ideology of the movement, but over time with this evolution that started in the 90s and where much more emphasis was put into autonomy of women, we see that the focus has shifted towards a non-state understanding of anti-fascism and internationalism. And the movement's ideology also considers this long-term trajectory of the history of power and domination, starting from the ancient Sumerian state 5,000 years ago to the present. So in many ways, how the movement talks about resistance against fascism and resistance against power, it's also drawing on this much older legacy of freedom in the region. But with the new martyrs, the internationalist martyrs, the movement is also able to connect non-state histories. So for example, the Kurdish people's struggle for existence currently unfolding is connected with these social histories or democratic histories in places like Europe. For example, Ivana Hofmann as a Black German, what does she represent? Anna Campbell, who was part of sabotaging hunting of the bourgeois in the UK and other things. These are all seen as democratic legacies within Europe and something to connect and unite different liberation struggles. So when the movement engages, for example, with the Zapatistas, with feminists in Latin America and elsewhere, it is moving towards this non-state partisanship of for democratic modernity. So it's a women's partisanship, which is also no longer just confined to the guerrilla militant who deliberately decides to put her life at stake and die in the struggle, but also women who die because of femicide, because of domestic abuse, because of war, because of militarism, are also now increasingly seen as martyrs of the women's struggle. So the last two photos I have here are civilian women, Deniz Poyraz and Hevrin Khalaf. One was killed by Islamists that are supported by the Turkish state in northern Syria, and the other was killed by an ultranationalist just a couple of weeks ago in one of the party headquarters of the People's Democratic Party. So increasingly we see that these women who have been killed by ultranationalists, by fascists, but also women who killed because of intimate partner violence, that they are also seen as part of a longer legacy of martyrs of the women's liberation struggle. So it's no longer just this very male-centric and kind of militant figure of a person with weapons that is a partisan, but everybody who kind of participates in the social and political and cultural sphere as well for a different world is seen as a partisan. So in this sense, just concluding on that note, that against these kind of more liberal framings of what the Kurdish movement is along these representational ideas about women and feminism and stuff, I think it is important to recognize and see that so much of the women's movement's legacy in Kurdistan comes from people who lost their lives, who have sacrificed their lives, who have done actions that are often whitewashed in how people talk about the Kurdish women's liberation struggle today. So I think I'll just stop here and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. So now we have time for some questions, comments. There are already some immediate reaction. I have one short, but I spoke a lot, so here at the back. Yeah.
Hello. Would you care to speak a little bit about the role of social media as a tool to give voice to the ideology that martyrs bring to these people? Okay.
Thank you. Are we going to collect questions or should I?
I can say one question that I have for you is, great presentation. I felt you are also addressing one very lively form of internationalism, or also form of solidarity that goes beyond what is a lot of times in the left, let's say in the last 20, 30 years, becoming some kind of just symbolic form of declaration. We stand in solidarity with this and that people, but this case that you describe so well through history is really like kind of, you know, just living counter archive, but also kind of this, you know, solidarity that is, you know, yeah, in a radical sense based on death and martyrdom, but then kind of goes beyond the death, right? So what you were explaining, kind of bringing together, kind of rituals. So I was just wondering, kind of, if you have some comment on the form of internationalism that, you know, maybe there are like almost like some three pillars. One is solidarity, second is martyrdom, and third is, of course, struggle. But struggle that is not just Kurdish, but then what you explained back in their own localities and so on. So that's just more a comment than a question, I don't know.
Hi, Dilar. Hi. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really very interesting. I wanted just to say two things, and maybe it's a kind of a question, but I just wanted to hear a bit more about that, and also two very important, I thought, aspects in your presentation. I mean, first of all, this idea of death as not, I mean, of course it is morbid, but it's also a celebration, and it is also a moment of actually making also the dead dwell with us. So there is like this undeadness, right? That actually, this is also a way of grieving and a way of celebrating and acknowledging, you know, that sacrifice. And I think this is really like, it is also a really beautiful thing that like certain cultures have this idea of that the dead dwell with us, and, you know, like that kind of continuation of the fight, you know. So that also the portrait of a martyr is also a territory, because it is beyond the land, and it is just like, you know, it wanders differently, like a bit like a chant or a hymn. And then I just wanted to say, like, that was really important and so beautiful that you said also that also the women that are victims of domestic violence are also partisans, because they have been also falling in the battlefield against patriarchy and all the rest. And that is also very important and very beautiful to see as well, that this is celebrated, that death is also celebrated as a form of sacrifice and martyr. And just to also acknowledge that the partisanship battle is not just about anti-fascism, but it is also anti-patriarchal and anti-imperialist, and like in all these things all together. And there is no fight without the other, and that's also so beautiful in the Kurdish struggle, that all these fights collapse together and coexist, and there is no hierarchies of such things. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Dilar. Thank you very much. It was super interesting and engaging. And I was wondering, because you were talking, and I think the ethics of sacrifice is something that is part of the partisan story, and has been used, and you explained beautifully in the case of the Kurdish struggle. But I was thinking about all around the 1960s and the uses of the demands of sacrifice, and how the sacrifice is embodied by the partisan, and thinking about and how is the image and the visual, in your case too, for example, with the image of the Che Guevara, how it's multiplied and reused and retaken in multiple places, and creating connections between multiple struggles. So I was thinking if you can comment, well, first I wanted to point out how important it is to bring this ethic of sacrifice, and this is not a specific element of the Kurdish struggle, but I wanted you, if you see similar strategies or difference in the uses of this sacrifice, you know, that in the 1960s and 70s was had other connotations that today, you know, for example. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so now you have a lot of comments and questions, and feel free.
Okay. Yes, I will try to answer some of them together.
I want to acknowledge that I find it very difficult to speak about the martyrs. I find it really difficult. So this presentation also just on an emotional level, it's so hard to communicate these ideas because they are so present in the community. So there is not a single Kurdish family, if you will, from northern Kurdistan, for example, that doesn't have a martyr. That's often how it's phrased. Like people have families, family members, friends that they know who one day decided to pick up a gun and go to the mountains. So we're talking about thousands of people here, and really thousands of people from all walks of life. And often these can be people who have studied. I and many other people, including many people in Austria, for example, know somebody who studied and went to university in a European country and then decided to go to the mountain. Or there are people who are from rural villages and who go. So it's so present, and that's why it's so difficult to talk about it also in a critical and reflected way, because it's so emotional. But I think I wanted to insist on focusing on the martyr also to show exactly what some of you have mentioned. That on one hand, it has a mobilizational role, it has a moral role to play. It's about remembering who has come before you in order for you to continue the struggle. It's for people who are not active parts of the militant aspects of any struggle, really not just the Kurdish one. It still has a humbling effect to think about how many people have given their life for a struggle. And I think considering this increasingly market-oriented left culture that we see in different parts of the world, especially in the Euro-American sphere, this high emphasis on the individual and individual achievement and empowerment along very liberal lines is something that is really very much opposite of this very revolutionary grassroots and lower class based notion of revolutionary sacrifice, I think, and not to romanticize the idea that you have to fight to death, but it is something that needs to be acknowledged. And I think in recent years, how people started to talk about the Kurdish liberation struggle is so divorced from this long legacy of sacrifice in prisons, in mountains, and elsewhere. And I think what I wanted to do by looking at the internationalist fighters in the last couple of years, and also by stressing, for example, the fact that many victims, so-called victims of patriarchal violence, have also been included in this language, is really precisely the women's liberation movement's focus on dismantling the political and the personal, to say whenever we fail to protect a woman in our community from patriarchal violence, this is blood that has been shed in the path of our liberation. And we're not saying that you are a hero when you die, no matter what is the cause for your death, but it is something that needs to be acknowledged, that this was a woman who struggled to survive and we couldn't protect her. So the struggle isn't just against some kind of abstract power entity, but it's happening inside our own communities. And recently, for example, people like Mariela Franco from Brazil or Berta Cáceres from Honduras and many women that have been killed in different parts of the world have also been incorporated in the movement's language and also its theories on. For example, the Kurdish women's movement produces work around political femicide, women's world democratic confederalism, and non-state forms of internationalism. So the political theoretical vocabulary of the movement has also been enriched by incorporating the women who are dying in different parts of the world as a result of violence. And I think when it comes to the role of media and social media and just cultural reproduction, I think, again, for example, social media has played a big role, I think, for the region in general in the last 10 years. But at the same time, it contributes to this lack of understanding, lack of historical thinking about trajectories or social histories of revolution, I think. And in that sense, I think remembering legacies of very radical thoughts and practice is something that needs to happen more, no matter what the struggle is, considering this highly neoliberal environment, I think, in which we operate. So I think it has several functions at once. It's a form of theory making, it's a form of coping inside society. So remembering the martyrs, of course, also emotionally valuable. But at the same time, there is also an element of commodification, I think, like similar to the Che Guevara image, for example, which you can now buy on T-shirts in places that produce T-shirts from sweatshops. You can also see that the image of the Kurdish woman fighter has become a very similar kind of tokenized and commodified image. And I think in that sense, I personally think emphasizing these histories of sacrifice helps protect legacies of revolution in that sense. I tried to take all of the questions together. I know I haven't been able to answer any of them in detail, but we are short on time.
Thank you, Dilar. It was great. Thanks. So we go to our next speaker there. Thank you, Dilar. Here you are. Hey, Angela.
Hey.
So here we go. The last speaker of today not, but of this panel, is Angela Dimitrakaki. She's a writer and art historian at the University of Edinburgh. Her books and articles focus on contemporary art and its context through Marxist feminist methodologies. She also co-edited the special issue Antifascism Art Theory for Furtex in 2019 that me, Paula, and a group of colleagues discussed in detail. And today she will speak of partisan cultures in the age of alt-right politics. Floor is yours, Angela.
Okay, I want to thank you for the invitation and everyone for being there, and apologies. I send my apologies for not being there myself as much as I wanted. In the first slide, which I think you have on your screen already, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So who's going to move the slides? Shall I say change of slide?
Yes,
Okay.
do that.
Okay, I'll do that. So, you can already see what technology is doing. So to repeat the title of this paper, Partisan Cultures in the Age of Alt-Right Politics. The first slide that you see there is from Athens on last year, on the last National Day in November 2020 of the anti-fascist struggle, the Polytechnic uprising that is said to have brought down the military junta I'll be referring to later on. So this is what Athens looked almost a year ago. That's in the city center. And then if you move on to the next slide, this is just the structure of what I'm going to talk about today. So it's just 3 parts so that you know what's coming. And we can move already to the slide after this, because I will start by saying that the partisan struggles of the 20th century and the early 21st century are separated by the Cold War, which ended in 1989 with capitalism as victor, capitalism as an idea and a practice. We live in the aftermath of this war, where post-socialism has become a planetary status quo, even if with situated exceptions. It is a fragile and complicated status quo, to be sure, articulated in the twists and turns, geopolitical and ideological, of capitalist globalization. What are its markers? I take 2. Empire by Carter Negri. It's a broader title, just the cover there, the very famous cover. And Necropolitics by Achille Mbembe, which opens with a chapter, Exit from Democracy. The thoughts I want to share today on the question of partisan cultures have developed against this background. The reproduction of capitalism as empire and the minimization of democratic interference in this reproduction. This paper will not then be a celebration or affirmation of partisan cultures, but rather focuses on the nature of the difficulty of creating partisan cultures against this background. Today, as teachers in art and theory, we may have to introduce the concept of post-capitalism. I'm sure most of you here have heard of this. Can we do this if we don't speak as historians? That is, if we don't discuss the outcome of the Cold War, which signaled a near ban on communism as a political project. Economic ideas from the left seem to be enjoying a resurgence, wrote the Independent, a British paper on the left, following the recent Norway elections, the left, whatever that is presented as that loose and that unclear. In the 90s, globalization happened from above, even if, as argued, it constituted, at least in part, a response to internationalism from below. Can I have the next slide, please? The global dogma of anti-terrorism upon 9/11 fell as a fire blanket on a transnational uprising, which was the then multi-globalization movement. Obviously, even where the 90s are concerned, the designation anti-capitalist for this movement indicates that the said transnational movement operated within the scope of an internalized traumatic defeat, the outcome of the Cold War. In the 21st century, the scale of distortion is phenomenal. Transcripts of Chinese students that come to be educated in the West, at least in Britain, show a course on Mao from their universities in China, combined with other courses on international markets and management. China, as such, ruled by a communist party, signifies a hybrid formation of central planning and markets that appeals to philosophers such as Nick Land, associated with neo-reactionary politics based on brutal social Darwinism and accelerationism. The capitalist markets are indeed everywhere, and everyone is forced to acknowledge them at the very least. The markets offer diversity and multiplicity of commodities. When we read that, can I have the next slide, please? Yep. That multiplicity is becoming the horizon of our political imagination, as put in 2019, December, actually just before the outbreak of the pandemic, by Hart and Negri. We know we are in a different terrain to the one where partisan culture formed. Hart and Negri's own review and reassessment of their book, Empire, 20 years after its publication, spelled out the difficulty of identifying a focused and therefore unified partisan culture today, unified under the banner of a propositional rather than merely oppositional politics. In conditions not just of multiplicity, but of ideological interchangeability, governments embracing key aspects of an effectively fascist agenda can pose as anti-fascist. Feminists are condemned as feminazis, even by men on the left, and fascism is replaced by populism. All these things, maybe they sound absurd, but they literally happen. And this short paper takes today's Greece as a case study of how and to what effect. So, moving to the first part, a rushed history of the end of the partisans and its consequences. What makes Greece an interesting case study is precisely the country's history in the 20th century. Today, it is one of the few Western countries with a traditional communist party in the parliament, which is more complicated than it sounds, given this party's commitment to communism and yet the ongoing resistance to acknowledging an expanded circle of political agents in updating the idea of communism and therefore partisan culture. And yet this party's trajectory is indicative of how capitalism fought against revolution, which necessitated the defeat of 20th century partisans whose historical moment was the resolute alignment of communism and antifascism. In summary, this history was determined not just by the Yalta Agreement, according to which Churchill and Stalin, I quote, concluded in the Kremlin on October 9, 1944, that the British share of responsibility in Greek affairs was defined as 90%, unquote, but also by a dirty war played on the partisans right when the anti-fascist communist army were seen as heroes in the country. The story remains little known beyond Greece. In 2014, can I have the next slide, please? The Guardian could still call the incident in the article's title as Britain's dirty secret. The article's opening summary is remarkable, where we read, when on December 3, 1944, 28, actually it was more, 28 civilians were killed in Athens, it wasn't the Nazis who were to blame, it was the British. Churchill's shameful decision to turn on the partisans who had fought on our side in the war sowed the seeds for the rise of the far right in Greece today. And this is the remarkable part, that the authors of this article see this and say this in 2014. Then in the article come the reminiscences of Greek poet Titos Patrikios, who was there, obviously, on the partisans' side. And he wrote, "The Athens police firing on the crowds from the roof of the parliament in Syntagma Square. The young men and women lying in pools of blood everywhere, rushing down the stairs in total shock, total panic. And then came the defining moment, the recklessness of youth, the passion of belief in a justice burning right. I jumped up on the fountain in the middle of Syntagma Square, the one that is still there, and I began to shout, 'Comrades, don't disperse. Victory will be ours. Don't leave. The time has come. We will win.' The time didn't come. There was no victory." Britain had been on the side of the partisans for 3 years, but when the Nazis were ousted, with the Communist Army of Eamelas as key, the National Liberation Front as key in this outcome, it was time for capitalist Britain to ensure that communism would be defeated. This was a long December. It continued into January 1945 and concluded with the Vargas Agreement on February 12, 1945, which was the disarmament of the partisans. Can I have the next slide, please? And there's a film of this, actually. We can see the partisans crying as they put down their weapons, knowing what this means. So this long December, when many thousands were killed, is cited as the biggest conflict in Athens since the beginning of the modern Greek state in 1830. Not only did it lead to the civil war between 1946 and 1949, but also ensured that the right would see itself as Greece's rightful owner for the remaining century. What did this mean exactly? I make only a passing reference to the Kirn's junta, the military junta, that plunged the country into a new dark age from 1967 to 1974. Can I have the next slide? The junta was installed when the Greek people had again dared to turn to the left. And it is certain that American imperialism and foreign policy played a role. What is of greater importance for my argument is what existed before and after the junta. What we see before is a constant persecution of any remaining traces of partisanship, accompanied by the tutelage of the right in education and everywhere else in the state apparatuses. The period after the military junta, which was my childhood and adolescence, so I was there for all this, is known as the return to politics or metapolitevsi. This is what metapolitevsi means, if you've heard of this. Understandably, there was yet again a boosting of the left. Yet the junta had served to extend into all state apparatuses, from schools to the police, the grip of what I would call the traditional right. The coming of the social democratic PASOK to power on October 18, 1981. Can I have the next slide? A landslide electoral victory changed the terms of the game and resulted in a significantly more liberal context where the left could breathe. And this is how the moderate Greek right reviews this period. Can I have the next slide? Because I think I've brought this quote. There. So we can read. The PASOK government did not simply officially recognize the national resistance, it also offered pensions to the veterans of all the resistance organizations. The partisans became the new national heroes. The war was no longer referred to as the bandit war, but as a civil war. And PASOK emerged as a third pole between the communist left and the right. The return of political refugees exiled in Eastern Europe after the Civil War, the renaming of streets and the removal of some of the symbols of anti-communism contributed, and that's a crucial part, to the revision of the collective memory of the Civil War. But PASOK had to capitulate to the demands of the hegemonic bloc internationally, and so it met the fate of most social democratic parties. It became more or less the same as its alleged ideological opponent. When the Soviet Union folded, and throughout the 90s, it became harder and harder to distinguish between the policies of the right and those of PASOK, alternating in government office. Syriza, the party that won the election in 2015 under the banner of the radical left, was successfully contained very quickly as a left parenthesis that failed to threaten the established order of Greek capital and indeed global capital, and not to mention the role of European capital. In July 2019, the right, under the very same name it had held since the Metapolitevsi, which this political party is called New Democracy, tellingly, not even seeing any need to change its name and camouflage itself as a new kid on the block, came into power. As put by the center-left press in 2019, this government was to operate through the police, religion, business dogma. So far, it has. Why has it been so easy for them? So, moving on to part 2, and Greece Today, Alt-Right Politics and the Distortion of History. The quote that you see there on the screen, it comes from a book of this year, 2021, written by Dimitris Giovas, a well-known cultural historian and professor in Birmingham, UK. The suggestion that PASOK's liberation of left consciousness back in the 80s contributed to the revision of the collective memory of the Civil War reveals a key aspect of the contemporary right's project, to rewrite history so as to demonize the historical left, and in particular, the partisans. In this respect, if I can have the next slide, Stathis Kalivas, originally an academic in the USA and now the Gladstone Professor of Government at Oxford University, takes the lead with frequent articles in the Greek national press. The right's revisionism of the 20th century is central to the sustained disempowerment of the left and the ideological form this takes. And of course, this involves also, as I note there, kind of whitewashing the junta and the collaborators with the Nazis, of course, right? So the strategy is generally to generate a historical narrative of equal distance and equal blame for the conflicts of the past century. Sustaining the illusion of centrist politics through historical revisionism is of the utmost importance for eradicating the left and for ensuring, on behalf of the Greek bourgeoisie, a public consensus of no alternative to the organization of the economy as a capitalist one. On this ground, on this consensus, you can then have political parties that can vary to a limited extent on their programs and policies. Distorting the collective memory on the partisans, about the partisans, is not then a side cultural project for the right, but the cornerstone of a broader ideological confusion that the contemporary right relies on for governing. The difference then between when Greek poets, such as Titus Patricius, that I mentioned before, were the partisans, because they were the partisans, and the current political stammering of Greek poets on partisanship is explicable, even if the critics are reluctant, the literary critics are reluctant to address it. How far has the ideological confusion project gone? Let me just say that the current Minister of Education, Nikki Kerameos, claimed during the National Remembrance Day of the war against Nazi Germany that populism, that's the word she used, led to the bloodshed of the world and Europe without mentioning Nazism and fascism. The same tactic of ideological confusion is now dominant in Greece's public space in relation to almost all matters, and it is affecting even the left. To give one example, when the trial of the neo-Nazi party Golden Dawn was reaching its conclusion in October 2020, a major national paper of the left presented the leader of the current right-wing government as belonging to the democratic wall against fascism. Can I have the next slide? That's a very famous cover, very widely discussed, and there's other politicians there, very far right. And so, our Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who has appointed a number of new fascists as ministers, as we speak. The latest reshuffling of cabinet saw a noted far-right nationalist anti-Semite as health minister, came to appear as anti-fascist, as if it wasn't the efforts of the anti-fascist movement. Can I have the next slide? Organizations such as these, the Golden Dawn Watch, and can I also have the next slide? This outside the courthouse, the people who had gathered there on the day of the verdict. So as if it wasn't the efforts of the anti-fascist movement that led to this result. Another example, in voting for the recent anti-labor law, the government presented it as a move to secure the rights of women in the workplace, an outrageous claim disproved by feminist organizations. I could go on and on with similar examples, but no doubt you get the picture. For my point is that Greece is living through a conspicuous and orchestrated undermining of political cultures of clear and committed positioning. It was no accident that Steve Bannon, figurehead of the American alt-right, was invited to the Athens Democracy Forum in 2019, or that Greece, pretending to be committed to Western-type democracy at least, recognized Venezuela's Guaidó as put by numerous press outlets also in 2019. Kind of rushed to do it. Such things would have been unthinkable a few years back, and suffice to say that Greek political parties had not originally supported the notorious Black Ribbon Day, 23rd August, voted by the European Union, which equated Nazism and Soviet communism, kind of called Stalinism, I guess. Although more research is needed in the EU archives. Athanasios Paphilis of the Greek Communist Party had said prophetically back in 2009 during the vote, "It is an insult to the memory of 20 million Soviets who sacrificed their lives to conquer fascism. This vulgar anti-communism is targeted not so much at the past, it is targeted mainly at the present and at the future. Its aim for today is to reduce grassroots resistance." End of quote. I would suggest that it was no accident that the increased references to totalitarianism took hold right when the global financial crisis was also happening, and which impacted Greece massively. In 2001, Slavoj Zizek opened his book, Did Somebody Say Totalitarianism?, with mention of the trajectory of this concept, noting the sea change in accepting the term since the 70s, as if you can click on these slides, you'll see the quote right there, as the theoretical defeat, can you just go back? Thank you. The theoretical defeat of the left, of how the left accepted the basic coordinates of liberal democracy and is now trying to defy its opposition and indeed position within this space. Greece, like the rest of the world, is no longer in 2001 when also the concept of post-democracy was being shaped and introduced. Today, and since the COVID-19 pandemic as a decisive force in shaping contemporary political lines, we see a formidable extension of the reach of alt-right ideology as conspiracy theories are shared by both the right and the left in their so-called extremes, and this is what matters, I think. Seeing also anarchists in anti-vax protests, now you can have the next slide, led by the far right, is telling. A confusion that extends to philosophy, and to see this, suffice only to think of what I would call the Agamben debates, also of course occurring in Greece, and also concerning the unclarity of where one should look in order to understand what establishes neo-authoritarianism. In short, partisan culture today is hard to establish as A, at least in Greece, there is an absolute confusion about who the enemy is, and B, when we have coordinates that bring together parts of the left and the right in anti-science, accelerationism as a technological solution, post-humanism, and the like. And moving to the third part. Despite all this, the struggle does go on. Despite that this Greece being the territory where a long active and passive counter-revolution pulls the strings, I would not concede that partisanship is eclipsed. First, anti-capitalist and anti-racial feminism, can I have the next slide? In Greece is of salient importance now. It has built important organizations such as the Feminist Autonomous Center for Research in Athens, which combines grassroots action and the school form, and numerous other kind of grassroots organizations, in fact. But although the Greek feminist movement does experience divides in this age of alt-right politics, and they're important, which we can perhaps discuss later, it remains a silent, evolving, increasing militant moment. This is not unrelated to the government's undermining of state feminism, which we had since the 80s in Greece. So the feminist movement speaks powerfully against alt-right masculinism in particular. I would say it's the only context where this is addressed, given especially the success of men's rights groups to upturn the family law that social democrats, that is PASOK, gave the country in the 80s, which was a huge development, a huge reactionary development alongside other things that have been happening since July 2019. Second, a telling moment for the rights revisionist efforts on public, if not, I would say, collective memory, were the demonstrations of thousands to protect the rights of prisoner Dimitris Koufontinas, a core member of the 17 November group, self-identified as an armed struggle group, who went on hunger strike. I would suggest that the public defense of this prisoner, with numerous, not numerous, but quite a few actually, very well attended rallies. So this level of public defense, and also there was online action, etc., suggests that although people like him are imprisoned under criminal law, there is indeed still a remainder according to which there is, this could be a political prisoner for some. And this signals that, it signals it to the right-wing government that they have not fully won the ideological war they have been fighting to eradicate, for instance, the notion of armed struggle and replace it with left terrorism. Yet, truly public debates on this matter are near impossible, and the criminalization of concepts and debates must be resisted. I would say that this is a key aspect, and there is tolerance because we've had a number of rallies in 2019 for in support of the Kurdish struggle. I have to say, I've been in all these events that I've presented so far, kind of in the rallies, but I would say that the public debate is just not there. And third, there is a strong and multi-layered anti-fascist movement. But beyond its core,
Slowly,
which in my view...
wrap up.
Yeah, it's a couple of paragraphs. Which is only beginning to generate and diffuse the necessary theoretical practice, as seen in the formation of just this year of the group Simio. Can I have the next slide? So despite efforts like this is a loose alliance. We saw the scale of the movement on the day in 2020 when the court announced the verdict on Golden Dawn. Thousands of us took to the streets, including people who had not demonstrated in recent years, or maybe ever. The police attacked us all, showing its allegiances as it has many times. Very few at the time realized the extent to which the current government would continue to accommodate and embolden the far right. As a result, in the past few days, fascists have been recruiting in Thessaloniki school through militia formations and asking youth to contact them at counterattack.com. Can I have the next slide, which is the final one? Of course, there have been very successful demonstrations. Yet, it is extremely hard to fight the combined fascism of street politics, of governmental access, and of mass media compliance. A recent investigative journalism piece by Reporters United revealed the extent of the government's communication strategy that I don't have the time to go in here, but which is crucial to their grip. However, two things should be already obvious. First, that the curbing of labor politics has resulted indeed in the fragmentation of partisanship, the actions of which remain issue-based. All these things are discrete issues, in fact, and they don't kind of come together. The alt-right, which infiltrates strongly the working classes of today in Greece, ensures that anger is captured by diffused fascist ideology centered on anti-feminist and anti-immigrant politics. Second, and following on from these, this prevents the coordinated development of a cultural field of left partisanship. The multiple fronts and ideological confusion generated by alt-right strategies of appropriation and distortion are the soft side of the brutality of the police apparatus, as all of us who have been involved as activists in all the aforementioned struggles know all too well. Therefore, the way forward, at least in Greece, requires not just the occupation of the streets, but also of public speech, the public sphere, the discursive public sphere, through the production of partisan theory, which is sorely lacking. Will this happen, and how? These are the questions I would pose, and they are devoid of optimism bias, although I would suggest that there is no alternative by trying relentlessly. Thank you.
Right, we try to, you are back, good. Thank you, Angela. We have time, few minutes for some questions, comments. We are running a bit late, but we will have some 20 minutes break and stuff in a bit.
I mean, I would be very happy to discuss in particular the grip of the right on cultural production, the role of also the confusing role of private foundations in kind of dominating the scene in Greece, and the private-public alliance. The scenes in literature and in the visual arts are different. I wouldn't say that it may be a little bit better in the visual arts. Literature is something that is highly problematic at the moment in relation to the subject we're discussing today.
I have one question for you. You know, I've been reading an article of a comrade from Greece who is doing research on some kind of, let's say, how the material from partisan struggle from Second World War is then kind of mediated later on in the Greek society. I mean, you talked a little bit about it, like you mentioned PASOK in 1981 and kind of their coming into, yeah, like new heroes of the national history, while at the same time neutralizing them of probably similarly of revolutionary dimensions or communist, because this was set up in this new, like what you say, the third alternative, neither the far right nor the communist left. So I'm wondering how much these kind of references inform maybe some radical art practices or collectives. Do they go back to the, like let's say, partisan left Second World War, or that's like more a matter seen as nostalgic matter or something?
No, it is not. This is the terrain of the war. And we do have institutions that have done important work, like State of Concept in Athens. They have had exhibitions in relation to this. So this kind of work does occur, but it's always very brave on the part of the independent institution to have it there. It is a long, I mean, I think there should be some research as regards because when you have capital heading, giving you the institutions to do that, and State of Concept is not one of that, it's an independent art institution, but more broadly. So when you have capital kind of funding this, it becomes really bizarre, kind of embracing the anti-fascists who are communists. And, there is defeat, not just by exclusion, but defeat by appropriation. And the partisans, the Greek partisans, the communist partisans of Greece of the 20th century, they need to be defeated again and again. This is what I tried to convey. And I think there is some kind of hesitancy, even among militant kind of formations to address this. There is a perception that, we will see you in the streets, that somehow anti-fascism is something that occurs in the streets. And when with some friends, we kind of engaged in a group called Anti-Fascist Culture. We wanted precisely to, but I didn't talk today about this. We wanted to go against this perception that anti-fascism is something that just occurs in the streets. When the fascist militia come out and there's someone there. This is an extremely important part, a heroic part, even within the context of what Bembe calls pacified democracies, absolutely. But there is, precisely because what is legal and what is illegal, is very clear in these pacified democracies, there is an urgent need for anti-fascists being expressed at the cultural and ideological level. The struggle needs to be there for public discourse, for the public sphere. It's very sorely missing.
Last comment, question. So, I see we need a small break. We will thank you, Angela.
Okay. Thank you.